Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and find a comfortable spot. Dim those lights and maybe adjust your pillows. Tonight, we're going to take a very long, very slow walk through the chilly, marble floored halls of 16th century France. We're going to talk about a woman who was arguably the most powerful mother in law in history, and a legendary pair of gloves that may or may not have been a very stylish death sentence. So just breathe, relax, and let's talk about Catherine de' Medici and the art of the grudge. Now, to understand Catherine, you have to understand that she was never really supposed to be the Catherine de' Medici. When she arrived in France at the age of 14 to marry Henry, the Duke of Orleans, the French nobility looked at her with the kind of polite disdain usually reserved for someone who wears socks with sandals. They called her the Italian shopkeeper's daughter, which is a bit of a stretch considering her family essentially owned Florence and had two popes in the drawer. But to the old-school French blue bloods, she was just a wealthy tourist with a merchant's last name. She was short, she had the famous Medici bulging eyes, which made her look like she was perpetually surprised by a very mild joke, and she was entering a court that valued physical beauty and effortless grace above all else. Her husband, Henry, was not exactly a fan. He spent most of his time with his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who was 20 years older than him and apparently possessed the secret to eternal youth, or at least a very good lighting technician. Catherine spent her early years in the background, watching, waiting, and probably taking very extensive notes on exactly who was being mean to her. She was the ultimate wallflower with a plan. For 10 years, she didn't produce an heir. In the world of 16th century royalty, a queen who doesn't have a baby is basically a decorative paperweight. There was talk of divorcing her, of sending her back to Italy with a thanks for the dowry note. But Catherine wasn't going anywhere. She allegedly turned to every mystic, doctor, and wise woman in Europe, drinking foul-tasting potions, and reportedly even wearing mule's urine and ground-up stag antlers, because, why not double down on the weirdness if it might save your crown? Eventually, it worked. She had 10 children, and suddenly the shopkeeper's daughter was the mother of the future of France. But the thing about Catherine is that she never forgot a slight. She had a memory like a filing cabinet made of ice. And as her children grew up, and her husband met a very messy end in a jousting accident where a wooden splinter went through his eye, which is a very high price to pay for a hobby, Catherine stepped into the spotlight. She swapped her colorful Italian silks for the heavy black mourning clothes she would wear for the next 30 years, earning her the nickname the Black Queen. Now, let's float over to the specific object of tonight's story, the gloves. To understand the gloves, we have to talk about Jeanne d'Albret. Jeanne was the Queen of Navarre, and she was, in every possible way, the opposite of Catherine. Jeanne was a staunch Protestant in a very Catholic France. She was austere, she was intellectual, and she had a backbone made of tempered steel. Catherine wanted to unite France by marrying her daughter Margot to Jeanne's son Henry of Navarre. It was a political match made in a very stressed-out version of heaven. Jeanne d'Albret did not want this marriage. She didn't trust Catherine. She called the French court a corrupt sink of iniquity, which, to be fair, was a pretty accurate Yelp review of the Louvre at the time. She arrived in Paris in spring of 1572 to negotiate the wedding, and she was miserable. The heat was stifling, the court was gossipy, and Catherine was being her usual, cryptically polite self. According to the legend, the one that has kept historians arguing over their tea for centuries, Catherine gave Jeanne a gift, a pair of beautifully scented, expertly crafted leather gloves. In the 16th century, gloves were the ultimate status symbol. They were often perfumed to mask the smell of, 16th century life. But these gloves were special. The story goes that they were treated with a slow-acting poison prepared by Catherine's personal perfumer and alleged alchemist of dark things, René Le Florentin. Now, did it actually happen? Or was Jeanne just a woman in her 40s with a failing immune system who succumbed to the stress of wedding planning and the damp Paris air? We'll get into the gritty, slow-motion details of that as we move forward. But for now, just imagine Jeanne sitting in her guest chambers, pulling on a pair of soft white leather gloves, unaware that the very scent she was inhaling might be the last thing she ever smelled. So Jeanne d'Albret is in Paris, and she's not having a good time. It's June. Paris in June, before the invention of modern plumbing, was less romantic getaway and more olfactory assault. This is why perfume was so important. And if you wanted the best perfume in France, you went to René Le Florentin. René had followed Catherine from Italy, and he was the quintessential creepy right-hand man. He had a shop on the Pont Saint-Michel where he sold high-end cosmetics, scented waters, and, if the rumors were true, the kind of powders you didn't want to find in your soup. The public loved him and feared him in equal measure. He was the man who made the queen look young and her enemies look dead. The poisoned glove theory suggests that René didn't just scent the leather, he infused it. The idea was that the poison would be absorbed through the pores of the hands, or perhaps the scent itself was toxic. In the 1500s, people believed in miasma, the idea that bad air could kill you. So the concept of a lethal perfume wasn't just a Gothic fantasy, it was a genuine medical fear. Jeanne d'Albret was already feeling unwell. She had been complaining of a pain in her side and a persistent cough. But a few days after her meetings with Catherine, her condition took a sharp turn for the worse. She developed a high fever. Her head throbbed. She became bedridden in her apartments, surrounded by her worried Protestant advisors. Now, Catherine, of course, was the picture of concerned maternal grace. She sent her own doctors to check on Jeanne. Now, in the 16th century, having a Medici send you their doctors was a bit like having a shark offer you a swimming lesson. You appreciated the gesture, but you were very aware of the teeth. The doctors performed the standard treatments of the day. They bled her, they gave her purgatives, and they generally did everything possible to ensure her body didn't have the strength to fight off a common cold, let alone a potential toxin. As Jeanne lay dying, the rumors began to swirl through the streets of Paris. The Protestants, the Huguenots, were already on high alert. They knew Catherine was a master of the Italian style of politics, which supposedly involved a lot of daggers and small vials. The story of the gloves spread like wildfire. It was the perfect villain origin story for Catherine. It fit the narrative of the Black Queen who would stop at nothing to clear the path for her children. But let's look at this through a sleepy, skeptical lens. Jeanne d'Albret died on June 9, 1572. An autopsy was actually performed, which was somewhat rare for the time because the rumors of poison were so loud that Catherine needed to shut them down. The doctors reported that Jeanne had an abscess in her lungs and a malformation of the heart. Basically, they said she died of natural causes. But of course, the conspiracy theorists of the 1570s weren't buying it. They pointed out that the doctors didn't examine the brain, which they believed René's special glovery poison would have left its mark. The legend became truth. In the minds of the people, Catherine had effectively gifted Jeanne out of existence just 2 months before the wedding of the century. Imagine the atmosphere in the palace after Jeanne died. The halls are draped in black. The air is thick with the smell of René's heavy floral perfumes, which now feel a little more suffocating than they did a week ago. Catherine is moving through the corridors, her silk skirts whispering against the stone, her face a mask of calm, grieving dignity. She has achieved what she wanted. The wedding will go on, and the formidable Jeanne d'Albret is no longer there to object to the fine print. It's a very slow, very calculated victory. There's no shouting, no dramatic reveals, just a woman who died in her bed and a pair of gloves that disappeared into history. Whether they were poisoned or not almost doesn't matter. The idea of them was enough to cement Catherine's reputation as the most dangerous woman in Europe. With Jeanne d'Albret out of the way, The path was clear for the wedding of the century between Margot de Valois and Henry of Navarre. This was supposed to be the grand peace, a Catholic princess marrying a Protestant king. It was meant to heal the wounds of France. Instead, it became the prologue to one of the most infamously unsleepy nights in history, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. But we're staying in the quiet moments before the storm. The wedding took place on August 18, 1572. Paris was packed. Thousands of Huguenots had traveled from the countryside to see their young leader, Henry, get married. They were in their finest, albeit slightly somber clothes. They stayed in the houses of Catholic nobles. They ate, they drank, and they probably looked at the gilded statues of the Louvre and thought maybe we can all just get along. Catherine, meanwhile, was likely not sleeping much. She was the architect of this entire fragile peace. She was also dealing with her son. So we're still here in the aftermath of that wedding, lingering in the drafty corridors of the Louvre. It's important to sit with the atmosphere of the French court for a while longer, because the story of the poisoned glove doesn't actually end with the death of Jeanne d'Albret. It lives on in the luggage. You see, when a queen dies in a foreign court, her belongings don't just disappear. There is a very slow, very tedious process of inventory. And for Catherine de' Medici, this was the moment of peak awkwardness. She had to oversee the packing of her rivals' things, while the city outside was still whispering about how those things, specifically the accessories, might have been weaponized. Imagine the scene. A quiet, candlelit room filled with trunk after trunk of Jeanne's clothing. Jeanne was a woman of plain living, but she was still a queen. There were heavy velvet gowns in dark, serious colors, piles of starched ruffs that looked like white dinner plates, and, of course, the gloves. Rows and rows of them. In the 16th century, you didn't just have one pair of gloves. You had gloves for hawking, gloves for riding, and sweet gloves for the evening, which were heavily infused with musk, ambergris, and civet. The clerks and the ladies-in-waiting would have handled these objects with a certain physical hesitation. If the Queen of Navarre had been poisoned by a pair of gloves, which ones were they? Was the poison still active? Could it seep through the paper they used for wrapping? It's that dry, lingering paranoia that defines the Medici era. Catherine, meanwhile, would have been present, not to help pack, obviously, but to supervise. She was a woman who understood the power of being seen as helpful while your enemy's life is being folded into a box. There is a certain snarky irony in the fact that Catherine, who was so often accused of using scent as a weapon, was herself a pioneer of the perfume industry. She brought the art of the profumier from Italy, effectively turning Grasse into the perfume capital of the world. Before her, French royalty mostly just smelled like, well, 16th century humans who ate a lot of game meat. Catherine introduced the idea that a lady should smell like a garden, or at least like a very expensive apothecary shop. But this gift of beauty came with a shadow. Because she made perfume so popular, she also made it the perfect cover for something darker. If everyone is walking around in a cloud of jasmine and cloves, no one notices the faint, metallic scent of arsenic or the bitter almond of cyanide. It was the perfect Medici move. Take something beautiful and make it a little bit terrifying. In the days following the inventory, Catherine's personal perfumer, René Le Florentin, remained at her side. He wasn't just a chemist, he was her confidant. While the court gossiped about his secret laboratory tucked away in a tower, he was likely just busy making the queen's favorite face creams. But in the eyes of the public, every time he stirred a pot, someone, somewhere, was surely about to drop dead. We have to look at the psychological weight of being Catherine during this time. She was a mother who was desperately trying to keep her sons on the throne, but her sons were complicated. Charles IX, the king at the time of the wedding, was slowly being consumed by a combination of tuberculosis and what we would now call extreme post-traumatic stress. He became obsessed with the idea that he was being poisoned himself. He started refusing food, or only eating what was prepared by a few trusted servants. He was living in the house that Catherine built, and he was terrified of the very shadows his mother used for shade. The poisoned glove story served a purpose for everyone involved. For the Protestants, it was a way to explain the loss of their brilliant leader without admitting she was just a middle-aged woman with a lung infection. For the Catholics, it was a whispered legend that made their Queen Mother seem invincible. And for Catherine, it was a reputation she didn't necessarily earn, but one she certainly didn't mind using. Power in the 16th century was 10% gold and 90% what people thought you were capable of doing to them in the sleep. Part 5. The Slow Decay of the Valois. As the 1570s dragged on, the poisoned glove incident became a sort of foundational myth for the decline of the Valois dynasty. The court didn't just feel dangerous, it felt stale. There's a very specific kind of boredom that comes with living in a palace where you're constantly checking your wine for sediment. It drains the energy out of the room. Catherine's children were falling like dominoes. After the bloody wedding and the death of Jeanne d'Albret, Charles IX's health went into a frail fall. He was only 23, but he looked like a man who had seen too much, which, to be fair, he had. There's a heartbreaking, almost pathetic detail from his final days. He apparently spent hours in his room blowing a hunting horn, trying to clear his lungs, the sound echoing through the Louvre like a lonely, dying animal. It was loud, it was annoying, and it was the sound of a dynasty running out of air. When Charles finally died in 1574, he was sweating blood, a symptom of his advanced TB, but of course the rumors immediately pointed back to, you guessed it, poison. The Italian shopkeeper's daughter was once again the lead suspect in the death of her own son. Because why stop with rivals when you can clear the way for your favorite son, Henry III? Henry was Catherine's darling. He was the one she had pinned all her hopes on. He was intelligent, he was stylish, and he was, in the words of the time, very peculiar. He loved jewelry, he loved his migon, his inner circle of very fashionable, very pampered young men, and he had a collection of lapdogs that he carried around in a basket hung from his neck. He was the ultimate aesthetic king. But the ghost of the poisoned glove followed him too. The court was now so saturated with the idea of Medici malice that every time Henry III introduced a new fashion, like a particularly high ruff or a new scent, the nobility wondered if it was a trap. He lived in a world where a gift was never just a gift. Catherine, now the Queen Mother for the third time, was getting older. The mourning black she wore was becoming a permanent part of her skin. She was still traveling across France in a litter, trying to negotiate peace treaties that no one intended to keep, her bulging eyes taking in a country that was slowly burning itself to the ground. She was a woman who had tried to scent over the rot of the kingdom, but the rot was winning. Think about her late nights in the Tuileries. She was a great builder, but she was building monuments to a family that was disappearing. Her daughter, Margot, the bride from the bloody wedding, was living in a sort of high society exile, having affairs and writing memoirs that would eventually spill all the family secrets. Her son Henry was increasingly isolated, his lapdogs being the only ones he could truly trust. There's a quiet, heavy sadness to this part of the story. The poisoned glove isn't just about a murder, it's about the total breakdown of trust. When a mother-in-law and a rival queen can't exchange a pair of gloves without it becoming a centuries-long murder mystery, the society they represent is already dead. They were just waiting for the physical reality to catch up with the spiritual collapse. And René Le Florentin, he stayed until the end. He survived the riots, the massacres, and the regime changes. He continued to sell his perfumes and his powders, a living reminder that in the world of Catherine de' Medici, beauty and death were always sold in the same bottle. He was the one who knew the truth about the gloves, but like all good perfumers, he knew how to keep a secret bottled up until it eventually evaporated.
As we reach the end of Catherine's long, dark walk through history, the smoke from the St. Bartholomew's Day fire has long since cleared, but the scent of those gloves, that mixture of lavender, leather, and suspicion, still lingers in the corners of the Louvre. It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective poison isn't something you swallow, it's the stories people tell about you when you're not in the room. So let the image of the Black Queen fade. She's sitting in her chair, her hands, uncovered and empty, resting on her lap. The trunks are packed, the dynasty is fading, and France is moving on to a new king, a man named Henry of Navarre, who survived the wedding, survived the massacre, and finally learned that in politics, it's always better to be the one giving the gloves than the one wearing them.
So we're still here, drifting through the drafts of the late 16th century. We've looked at the death of Jeanne d'Albret and the blood on the wedding lace, but the story of the poisoned glove has a way of stretching out, much like the shadow of Catherine herself. It's important to understand that in the Renaissance, a rumor wasn't just a piece of gossip. It was a permanent architectural feature of a person's life. Once the idea of the poisoner queen was out there, it didn't matter what the autopsy said. It didn't matter that the doctors found a lung abscess. The glove was the story, and the story was the truth. Let's look at the atmosphere in the weeks after Catherine finally buried her rivals she had supposedly gifted out of existence. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a palace when everyone is trying to act normal while being absolutely terrified. Catherine was back to her usual routine, writing dozens of letters a day, managing the finances, and trying to keep her son, King Charles IX, from having another public meltdown. But the court had changed. Every time a gift was presented at court, a piece of jewelry, a length of silk, or yes, another pair of gloves, there was a tiny microscopic pause, a hesitation before the recipient's fingers touched the material. You can almost see the courtiers, their eyes darting toward Catherine, wondering if this was a simple token of affection or a very slow-acting goodbye. It's that dry, ironic tension. Catherine had become a victim of her own perceived competence. She was so good at being the Black Queen that she could never just be a mother-in-law again. And what about the room where Jeanne d'Albret died? In the Louvre, rooms have memories. For years afterward, that particular suite of apartments was whispered about. People claimed they could still smell it, that specific, cloying mixture of René's heavy floral perfumes and the metallic tang of something that didn't belong. It became part of the palace lore, a ghost story told to new arrivals to remind them that in the French court, it wasn't the daggers you had to worry about, it was the accessories. There's also the matter of the alchemist's laboratory. Legend says that Catherine had a secret tunnel built between the Louvre and René Le Florentin's shop on the bridge. Now, logically, why would a queen need a tunnel to buy perfume? She's the queen, she can just have it delivered. But the tunnel represents the psychological distance Catherine kept from her subjects. She lived in a world of back stairs and hidden passages. To the people of Paris, she wasn't just a ruler, she was a magician who dealt in the invisible. The poisoned glove was just the most fashionable version of her magic. As the decade wore on, the tragedy of the situation began to settle into the bones of the Valois family. Catherine had eliminated her rival, but in doing so, she had poisoned the well for her own children. Her daughter Margot, the bride of blood, spent the rest of her life trying to escape her mother's shadow. She was a woman of immense intelligence and spirit, but she was forever linked to that night in August and the woman who had, allegedly, sent a pair of gloves to clear the aisle. Margot's memoirs are a fascinating study in family baggage. She writes about the court with a mix of affection and horror. She lived in a world where her mother was the sun, but a cold, black sun that provided no warmth. The poisoned glove wasn't just a murder weapon in these stories, it was a symbol of the Medici touch. Everything Catherine touched turned to gold, then to power, and then to ash.
And then there's the final, slowest part of this story, the physical decay of the legend. In the late 1800s, during the era of Romanticism, French writers became obsessed with Catherine de Medici. They took the poisoned glove story and turned it into high drama. They imagined Catherine sitting in a dark room, stirring a cauldron of toxic oils, while René La Florentine whispered incantations. They turned a tragic, likely natural death into a gothic horror movie. But if we peel back the velvet curtains and look at the real Catherine, we see something much more tired. We see a woman who was just trying to survive in a world that hated her for her blood, her money, and her gender. The poisoned glove was a weapon she probably never used, but it was a weapon she was forced to carry in her reputation every single day. Imagine her in her final years at the Château de Blois. She's old, she's heavy, and her heart is failing. The kingdom is in ruins, and her last son is about to be assassinated. She's surrounded by her things, her tapestries, her books, and yes, her many, many pairs of gloves. She looks at them, and she knows what the world says. She knows that when she's gone, the shopkeeper's daughter will be remembered as the woman who killed with a scent. It's a very quiet, very lonely ending. No dramatic music, no final confession. Just the sound of the wind through the Loire Valley and the smell of old leather and dried lavender. Catherine de Medici, the woman who supposedly knew every secret and held every vial, died with the biggest secret of all, whether she was actually a villain or just a woman who was very, very good at being misunderstood. We're going to let the 16th century go now. The candles in the Louvre are flickering out, one by one. The trunks are finally locked, the gloves are folded away, and the Black Queen is at rest. The air is clear, the smoke is gone, and we can finally breathe without wondering what's in the perfume. Now, even though Catherine is gone, we're going to stay in this headspace for just a little bit longer, because a reputation like hers doesn't just stop when the heart does. It lingers, much like a stubborn scent in a velvet-lined drawer. The poisoned glove became the blueprint for how we view powerful women in history, as if they can't just be politicians, they have to be sorceresses. In the years following Catherine's death in 1589, the stories actually got more elaborate. Historians of the 17th century, who were mostly writing to please the new Bourbon dynasty, had a vested interest in making the previous Valois dynasty look like a den of vipers. They took the poisoned glove and added more facts. They claimed that Catherine didn't just kill Jeanne d'Albret, but that she had a whole wardrobe of lethal fashion. Poisoned boots, poisoned handkerchiefs, even a poisoned lipstick that would kill anyone who kissed the wearer. It's that doubling down on the absurdity, because why stop at one murder when you can turn a woman into a walking armory of toxic haberdashery? But the reality of the 16th century was much messier and much more human. People died of things we can fix today with a basic round of antibiotics. A tooth infection, a scratch from a rusty nail, or a damp room could end a royal line as effectively as any Italian powder. But she died from a persistent cough, and poor sanitation doesn't make for a good campfire story. She died because her rival gave her a pair of enchanted, toxic gloves is the kind of story that stays awake with you. It's the kind of story that defines an era. Think about the legacy of René La Florentine. After Catherine died, he didn't just vanish. He became the prototype for every mad scientist and sinister alchemist in literature. His shop on the bridge became a landmark of dark tourism before tourism was even a thing. People would walk past and point, whispering about the woman who used to come there in the dead of night to buy the ingredients for her special gloves. The poisoned glove is a reminder of how we use stories to make sense of tragedy. The death of Jeanne d'Albret was a massive blow to the Protestant cause. It felt unfair. It felt too convenient for Catherine. And when things are too convenient, we look for a villain. We look for a pair of gloves. As we finally drift away from this story, let's consider the irony one last time. Catherine de' Medici spent her life trying to build a legacy of stability and power for her children. She used every tool she had: marriage, diplomacy, and yes, probably a bit of intimidation. But in the end, her most lasting legacy wasn't a stable throne or a unified France. It was a pair of gloves that probably never even existed. She is remembered not for what she built, but for what we think she destroyed. And there is a certain sleepy sadness in that. A woman who worked so hard to be seen as a queen, only to be remembered as a ghost in the perfume aisle. So let the shadows of the Louvre stretch out. Let the sound of the carriage wheels on the cobblestones fade into the distance. We've walked through the smoke, we've handled the silk, and we've smelled the lavender and the lead. The harem fire is out, the Habsburg jaw is at rest, and the poisoned glove is just a story we tell to keep the night interesting. Go ahead and let your eyes close if they haven't already. The history is still there, but it's quiet now. It's just a long, slow walk through a gallery of people who were just as tired, just as complicated, and just as human as we are, even the ones who supposedly wore poisoned gloves.